I didn't hear the fiancé's voice at first. I heard the silence after it. The call was still live on the black marble desk, the tiny screen glowing beside a half-empty glass of whiskey, and every man in the room had gone still because the boss had just raised one hand. Not a word, not a movement, just that one sharp gesture, and the entire penthouse obeyed. I was standing near the door in my plain black maid's uniform, holding a silver tray so tightly my fingers hurt. I should have looked away. I didn't. On the phone, her voice drifted out clean and careless, the kind of voice that only sounds sweet when it's being cruel. "She's just the maid," she said, laughing softly to someone on the other end. "He's too blind to notice. By morning, I'll have him back where I want him." My stomach tightened. The boss didn't move, but the air around him changed. Cold, controlled, dangerous in the quietest way. He reached for the phone, not hurried, not angry, and pressed it to speaker. "Say that again," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The fiancée laughed like she still held the room. "I said she's nothing. You can replace her." That was the moment I understood two things at once. She didn't know he was listening, and he had just learned exactly what kind of woman he planned to marry. The boss's eyes lifted to me. Not my face first. My hands. The tray. The way I was still standing straight, even though every instinct told me to shrink. I felt exposed, but I didn't drop my gaze. I didn't beg. I waited. That seemed to matter to him. "Put the tray down," he said quietly. I did. He crossed the room in 3 measured steps, took the phone from the desk, and ended the call without a second thought. Then he looked at the empty screen for one beat, like he was deciding which part of his life to burn first. "You heard that," he said. It wasn't a question. I swallowed once. "Yes, sir." "And you stayed." "I was told to." A flicker moved across his face then. Not warmth. Respect. Something sharper. Something earned. Behind him, one of the men by the bar lowered his eyes and stepped back, making space without being asked. That was power too, I realized. Not shouting, not threats. Everyone in the room had already decided the boss's silence meant trouble. He turned back to me. "What's your name?" "Lena." "Lena," he repeated, like he was testing whether it belonged in his world. It didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like a choice. Before I could answer, the intercom on the wall buzzed. His assistant's voice came through, tight and careful. The fiancée was downstairs, demanding to be brought up immediately. The room waited for his reaction. He stared at the door, then at me, then at the tray I had set down. One decision hung between us, invisible and final. If he let her in, the lie continued. If he stopped her now, everything shifted. He reached for his jacket. "No," he said. One word. "Absolute. Tell her the engagement is over." Even I felt the shock of it. The assistant hesitated. "Sir, now." The line clicked dead. The men in the room didn't speak. None of them dared. I could hear my own breathing, soft and uneven, while the boss turned slightly toward me again, as if the rest of the penthouse had become background noise. "From this moment on," he said, "she doesn't get to decide who is invisible in my house." He glanced once at the closed door, where his fiancée would soon learn the world had moved without her. Then his eyes came back to me, steady and unreadable. "And neither do you." My pulse jumped, because that sounded like control, but it also sounded like protection. Outside the door, footsteps approached. Inside, the old future was already gone. He had made his choice. And because he did it out loud, in front of everyone, there was no clean way back for either of us. The silence after his order felt heavier than the rain outside. No one moved. No one even breathed too loud. Then the fiancée's heels came fast and sharp across the marble hall, and the door swung open so hard it hit the wall. She took one look at him, then at me, and the color drained from her face. "What is this?" she said, but the boss never looked away from me. "It's over," he answered, calm as a locked door. "You don't speak to her that way again. You don't enter my penthouse without being invited. And you don't make decisions for me in front of my people." Her jaw tightened. "You're doing this because of her." For the first time, he turned fully toward her. Not with anger. With finality. "I'm doing this because I should have done it sooner." The room stayed frozen. Even the men by the bar looked like they wished the floor would open and take them. I should have felt victorious. Instead, my chest tightened, because I could see what it cost him to say it out loud. The line he had just crossed was not a small one. It would not be forgiven. Not by her. Not by the families. not by the people who lived on his obedience and feared his silence. He had not just ended an engagement. He had broken a public arrangement that carried weight, money, and consequence, and he had done it in front of me. The fiancée laughed once, but it sounded brittle, like glass under pressure. "You think this is about choice?" she said. "This is a boardroom, not a charity case." That finally made me look at her. She wasn't wrong. In her world, women like me were the kind people moved around. Useful, quiet, disposable. And in another life, I might have agreed with her that I had no place here. But the boss spoke before I could shrink back. "She is not a case," he said, "and she is not yours to measure." His voice never rose. It didn't need to. That was the strange part. He didn't dominate the room by volume. He did it by certainty. Still, certainty had a cost. I could see it in the way one of the men lowered his eyes and reached for his phone, already calling someone higher up. I could see it in the way his fiancée's hand trembled before she hid it inside her sleeve. And I could see it in the boss's jaw, tight enough to hurt. He was choosing this in real time, and I was the reason the consequences had started moving. The assistant tried to speak again, but the boss lifted one finger and the man stopped at once. Then he looked at me, not like a man claiming a prize, but like a man trying to make sure I understood the next step before he took it. "You can leave if you want," he said quietly. "No one will stop you." The offer landed harder than any command would have, because for the first time, the power in the room was not being used to trap me. It was being handed back to me, even here, even now. My throat tightened. I glanced at the door, then at the fiancé, then at the man who had just detonated his own future without touching me once. He had given me a choice, but the choice was not clean. If I walked out now, I would be walking away from whatever safety his protection might mean. If I stayed, I would be stepping into a fire that already had my name in it. My fingers curled around the edge of my sleeve. The bruise on my wrist from the earlier grab had already started to fade, but I still felt its memory like a warning. I took one step toward the door, and the room shifted. Not because anyone stopped me, because nobody did. The boss saw it, too. He didn't follow. He only reached back, picked up his jacket from the chair, and set it over the arm of the sofa nearest the exit. Not on me. Near me. A small thing. Deliberate. A promise without possession. The kind that said if I chose to stay, he would not make that choice for me. The fiancée stared at the jacket like it insulted her personally. Then she looked at me, and for 1 second I saw something raw there too. Humiliation, yes, but also recognition. She had been pushed aside in public. I had been invited into the wreckage. Neither of us was winning cleanly. "This isn't over," she said to him. He nodded once. "No," he said. "It isn't." And because he said it without apology, I understood the true shape of the danger now. He wasn't asking me to trust his feelings. He was asking me to survive the aftermath with him. I reached for the jacket. Not to wear it, just to hold it for a second, to feel its weight, its heat still trapped in the fabric. Then I set it back down and met his eyes. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I only stayed where I was, which somehow changed everything. His shoulders loosened by a fraction, like he had expected defiance and found something harder to name. The assistant cleared his throat, pale as paper. "Sir, the family is asking for a statement." The boss didn't look away from me. "Tell them I made a decision," he said. "And tell them she gets to hear the next one before anyone else does." That was the new barrier, laid down in a single sentence. Secrecy was over, but so was convenience. From now on, every step would have to survive the light. And as the first voices rose outside the penthouse door, I realized the connection between us had changed shape. Not softer, not safer, real. And real meant it could be broken. I didn't move when the noise outside thickened into a low, restless murmur. That was the first thing he noticed. Not the way I sat. Not the way I dressed. The fact that I stayed. His men stood along the glass wall like shadows with discipline, waiting for him to give the room back to fear. He didn't. He kept his eyes on me and said, "Come with me." Not as an order, as a test. I followed him out of the penthouse and into a corridor that smelled like polished stone and rain-soaked wool. The city lights spread below us in hard gold lines, and for a second the whole world looked quiet enough to pretend it was normal. Then his assistant handed him a tablet, spoke in a fast, clipped voice about the family statement, the board, the people waiting downstairs. He barely listened. He looked at me instead. "They want a reason," he said. "Give them one." I understood what he meant before he finished. Not a speech. Not a performance. A choice. So when we reached the private conference room and the doors opened on a dozen waiting faces, I did the one thing nobody there seemed prepared for. I went straight to the far end of the table, picked up the folder that had been left closed in front of his seat, and set it back down where he could reach it without looking foolish. It was a small thing. That was why it mattered. No drama. No challenge. Just structure, return to the right place. He watched my hands more than my face. Inside the folder were the numbers everyone had been avoiding, the names of the vendors, the contracts that had to be honored before midnight, and one page everyone else had marked in red because it was ugly and expensive. I turned that page over and pointed at the line that mattered. If you cut this now, I said quietly, the families on the east side lose medical coverage in 2 weeks. The room went still. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He leaned over the table, read the line himself, and his jaw tightened once, hard and controlled. He had expected me to be afraid of the room. He was beginning to learn I was afraid of different things. How do you know that? One of the men asked. My answer was simple. Because someone has to. No voice rose. No one interrupted. But I felt the change in him as clearly as if he had touched my wrist. He shut the folder, not because he disagreed, but because he had decided the cost would be his to carry. Move the meeting, he said, and call the hospital liaison. She's staying. The last part landed differently. Not as ownership, as trust with weight on it. One of the men looked surprised. Another looked irritated. The assistant looked relieved, which told me enough. I had been placed where the consequences lived, not where the spotlight did. And that was its own kind of power. When the room emptied, he stayed behind me for a moment, close enough that I could hear the restraint in his breathing. You saw what they missed, he said. I didn't smile. I only rested my hand on the edge of the table, steadying myself against the pressure of being seen too clearly. No, I said. I just didn't look away. That was when he handed me the tablet himself. Not to hold. To read. The screen showed a second meeting time already set, a smaller circle, fewer people, my name entered beside his as if it had always belonged there. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like responsibility finding my throat. Because now if I was wrong, it would not only be him paying for it. It would be the people waiting below, the families depending on a decision made in a room full of power and very little mercy. He saw that flicker in my face and understood it. His voice dropped lower. You don't get to disappear now. I looked up. Was I ever going to? He held my gaze for a beat, then nodded once toward the door. No, he said. Now I'm making sure of it. And when we stepped back into the light, I knew the next part would cost more than silence. It would cost me being visible when it was safer to be small. But he had already chosen to stand beside that choice, and in his world, that meant everything had changed. The room below was louder than the one we'd left behind. Not with voices. With consequence. Men in dark suits stood in loose circles near the tables, their attention shifting when we entered as if the air itself had changed shape. I felt it immediately, the weight of being seen. Not as a shadow, not as an accident, as a decision. My name was still on his arm in the memory of the people who watched us, and that alone seemed to make the floor colder beneath my shoes. He didn't rush me forward. He let me feel every eye, every pause, every careful glance that measured whether I belonged there or had simply wandered too close to something dangerous. One of the older men stepped in first, polite in the way power can afford to be polite. She's the one, he asked, not bothering to lower his voice. The question landed like a hand on my throat. I almost looked at him, but his fingers brushed the inside of my wrist, barely there, a warning and a promise at once. Not to hide, to stand. So I did. Yes, he said before I could answer for myself. Just one word. No decoration. No apology. But it was enough to make the room settle into a new shape. The older man's gaze moved over me again, slower now, less certain. Then she understands what's being asked. I did understand. That was the problem. Understanding meant knowing there would be no soft edge to any of this now. If I stayed beside him, I would not only be seen when it was safe. I would be seen when it was expensive. I looked at the table, at the folded papers, at the people waiting for a version of me that could be convenient. Then I looked at him. He did not ask me to perform courage. He simply gave me room to choose it. Tell me what happens if I say yes, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. A few heads turned. He answered without looking away from me. Then they stop speaking about you like you're a risk they can manage. A small silence followed. Not empty. Heavy. Honest. And if I say no? I asked. This time his jaw tightened, just slightly. The answer came after a beat that told me he was choosing truth over comfort. Then you walk out of here alone. No threat. No pressure. Just the brutal shape of a real choice. And because he said it that way, I knew exactly how much it cost him to say nothing else. He was giving me back my freedom in the only room that had enough power to take it away. That was the moment I felt the world shift. Not because he protected me from it, but because he let me see what it would demand of me if I stayed. The older man exhaled through his nose, clearly unimpressed by hesitation, and one of the others slid a chair back an inch as if the meeting itself had turned toward me. I understood then that this was the threshold. If I stepped forward, I would no longer be a visitor near his life. I would be part of the cost of it, part of the risk, part of the silence people had to answer to. My pulse thudded hard enough to hurt. I thought of the easy version of my life, the one where no one knew my name and no one expected my hands to steady anything fragile. Then I thought of what it meant that he had not used me, had not folded me into the room like a possession, but had placed the choice where it belonged, in mine. So I moved. One step, then another, until I stood at the table beside him, close enough to feel the heat of his restraint, close enough for everyone in the room to understand that my presence was no longer temporary. I'll stay, I said. The words were simple. The cost behind them was not. His eyes changed first. Not relief. Something deeper. Something like respect sharpened by need. The older man nodded once, slow and reluctant, and the papers were turned toward me as if they had been waiting for my hand all along. I took the pen. My fingers trembled only when I wrapped them around it. He noticed. Of course he did. And without touching me, without making the moment smaller, he shifted just enough to block the room from seeing it. That tiny mercy undid me more than any grand gesture could have. I signed, not because I was safe, because I was no longer willing to pretend that safety was the same as living. And when I set the pen down, the room answered in silence, so complete it felt like a door closing behind me. I had crossed into his world, but it was already clear that his world would not be allowed to remain only his. The moment I gave them my name, I gave them my nerve, my limits, and my future. He looked at the page, then at me, and said quietly, "Now they'll expect you to hold it." I swallowed hard. Then I'd better learn fast. That almost smile touched his mouth like a secret. But beneath it, I saw the pressure settle in fully. There would be no going back to invisibility now. Not for me. Not after this. The paper felt heavier after my name was on it. Not because of ink. Because of what it had changed. The room stayed still for one long beat. Like even the air understood that I had stopped being an observer and become part of the structure holding this place up. He took the document from me, glanced once at the signature, and didn't smile. That would have made it easy. Instead, he set it down with a kind of care that felt more dangerous than force. "From this point on," he said, "what touches this house touches you too." I should have hated how much that sounded like a warning. I should have hated more that it sounded like protection. When the meeting ended, the others moved first, already shifting their attention to me in a way they hadn't an hour ago. Not curiosity. Expectation. The kind that doesn't ask if you're ready. The kind that only asks whether you'll break. I felt it in every glance, every pause, every door that opened and closed a little too quietly around me. And for the first time, I understood the real cost of being seen. If they could name me, they could place weight on me. If they could place weight on me, they could test whether I would carry it. He didn't leave my side right away. He walked with me into the corridor, one measured step behind, giving me room without letting me drift too far. It was such a small thing, but it changed the shape of the night. Because I realized he wasn't guarding my body anymore. He was guarding my position. And positions can be lost. We reached the side hall, where the light was dimmer and the noise of the room dulled to a hush. He stopped there, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on me as if he was waiting for me to understand something I still hadn't earned the right to hear. "You kept looking for permission," he said. "Tonight, you gave it to yourself." I almost answered him with something sharp, something safer. But then I remembered the pen in my hand, the silence after I signed, the way my own pulse had sounded in that room like a second signature. My fear had not vanished. It had simply changed shape. It was no longer fear of him. It was fear of what I had agreed to become. That realization hit hard enough to make my throat close. Because belonging was not the same as being protected. And being protected was not the same as being trusted. The difference had been there all along, hidden inside every decision I thought I was making for survival. He saw the shift in my face before I could hide it. "You don't owe me gratitude," he said quietly. "You owe yourself honesty." That should have been a relief. Instead, it cut deeper, because I knew he meant it. He was giving me a freedom I had not asked for and could not refuse. The freedom to choose, now that choosing had consequences. By the time we reached the door, the hallway felt narrower than before. Not because the walls had moved, because the future had. I looked back once at the room behind us, at the men who had already started measuring me differently, and I understood that my signature had not just placed me beside him. It had placed me in the line of impact. And if I stayed, I would have to become someone who could absorb it. I turned back to him. "Then teach me what it costs," I said. His gaze held mine, steady and unreadable for one long second. Then he nodded once, like a man accepting a battle he had already decided to lose for me if he had to. "Fine," he said. "But from now on, if they come for you, they come through me." The words should have sounded like ownership. Coming from him, they sounded like a vow. And that was the moment I knew nothing about this would remain simple. Not my place. Not his restraint. Not the thing growing between us under all that power. Because I no longer wanted to be hidden inside his protection. I wanted to be worthy of standing in it. I watched the room change the second he said it. Not because his voice got louder. He never needed that. It changed because the men around us understood exactly what kind of promise had just been made, and what kind of consequences came attached to it. One of them looked at me like I had suddenly become a number on a ledger. Another looked at him like he had lost his mind. I felt my throat tighten, but I kept my face still. I had asked to stand beside him. Now I was learning what that actually meant. He reached for the folder in front of him and slid it toward me. "Read the final clause," he said quietly. I did. My name was there again. So was the word indemnify. So was a sentence that made my pulse trip. If I signed, I would be tied to every loss that came from the agreement. Every breach. Every retaliation. Every mistake. I looked up. "You knew this was in here." It wasn't a question. He didn't deny it. "Yes." "And you let me read it anyway?" His jaw flexed once. "I let you choose." The answer hit harder than any lie would have. Because it meant he had trusted me with a door that could not be closed once I walked through it. I stared down at the page, hearing the room breathe around me, hearing the soft scrape of a chair somewhere behind us, hearing my own fear trying to become a decision. This was the part no one ever told you about power. It did not only ask what you wanted, it asked what you were willing to carry when you got it. I took the pen. The men across the table watched me like I was making history or a mistake. Maybe both. My hand trembled once, then steadied. I signed my name. The silence after felt heavier than applause. He did not smile. That was what made it worse. He just closed the folder and looked at me with that same unreadable calm, as if he had been waiting for me to become real inside this world. "Now it's on record," he said. "Now they can come at you through the contract. Through me. Through anything they can touch. Then don't ask me to hide," I said before I could stop myself. The sentence hung between us, sharp and alive. For the first time, his expression changed. Not softness. Respect. And maybe something more dangerous. He stood, circled the table, and stopped beside my chair. His hand came down on the back of it, not touching me, but close enough that I could feel the heat of him. "That's the point of no return," he said. "From this moment on, every move I make will carry your name with it." My stomach tightened, because I understood the trap inside the vow. If he protected me, he exposed me. If he stepped back, he left me vulnerable. If I stayed, I became part of the cost. Across the room, one of his men answered a call and went pale. He covered the phone and looked straight at us. "They found out she signed," he said, "and they're already moving." I felt the air leave my lungs. Not because of the threat, because of the timing. We had no room left for hesitation now. He held my gaze for one long second, then turned to the others with a voice like iron. "Lock the building. Nobody leaves alone." Then, to me, quieter, "Stay where I can see you." It should have sounded like control. Instead, it sounded like the last safe sentence either of us would get for a long time. The building went quiet in the way a body goes quiet right before panic sets in. No footsteps in the hall. No elevator chime. Just the low hum of locked doors and the sound of my own breathing catching too fast in my chest. He didn't look at the men first. He looked at me, like the entire floor had narrowed to the space between us. "Stay here," he said again. But this time there was something else under the command. Not control. Fear. He hated that I could hear it. I hated that I could too. One of his men stepped forward with his phone still in hand. "Sir, the message wasn't just about the signature. They have the copy, the timestamp, everything. If they push this before morning, they won't," he cut in. But even as he said it, I saw the calculation in his eyes. Not for the business. For me. He was already deciding what to sacrifice. That was the part that hurt most. Not the threat. The fact that he was willing to bleed first. "What are they going to do?" I asked, and my voice sounded too small in the dark glass room. He came closer, slow enough that I could have stepped back if I wanted to. I didn't. "Use what you signed to make it look like you chose all of this," he said. "If they control the story, they control you." My stomach turned. Not because I didn't understand. Because I did. They weren't just coming for him. They were coming for my name, my choice, my right to say yes or no to anything that mattered. He saw the change in my face and stopped in front of me. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "If this goes public the wrong way, they'll turn you into leverage. I won't let that happen. And if protecting me makes it worse?" The question hung there between us, sharp and honest. For the first time that night, he didn't answer right away. That silence told me more than any vow could have. Because he knew it was true. He could save me and expose me. He could hide me and make me look guilty. He could use every weapon he owned and still lose the one thing that actually mattered. Me. Across the room, his men were already moving. One was pulling blackout curtains shut. Another was killing the lights on the lower floor. Someone slid a tablet across the table with maps, names, and routes I didn't understand and didn't want to understand. I only watched his face. He was giving orders like a man building a wall with his bare hands, and every word sounded like a goodbye he refused to say. Then, suddenly, he reached into his inner coat pocket and took out the one thing I'd seen him keep close since the beginning. My bracelet. The thin silver chain I had once thought was too ordinary to mean anything. He set it in my palm and closed my fingers around it. "If they come in, you don't argue. You don't protect me. You leave with Luca through the service stairwell." I stared at him. No, his jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. "That wasn't a request. You said you'd stop deciding for me." The words came out before I could soften them. They landed hard. He looked at me like I had just touched the most dangerous part of him. Then he exhaled, once, controlled and rough. "I'm not deciding for you. I'm choosing the smallest lie that keeps you alive long enough to have a real choice tomorrow." I felt something in me break open at that. Because it wasn't just power anymore. It was trust. Ugly, painful, real trust. I could walk away from him right then and still know he had finally learned the difference between protection and possession. That was the fragile hope. That he was changing in the middle of the storm. That he was letting me stand beside him instead of behind him. A sharp knock hit the outer door. Then another. Harder. One of the men swore under his breath. On the tablet, a live security feed flickered to life just long enough for me to see headlights sweeping across the front of the building. Too many. Too close. He heard it too. His hand found the back of my neck, not to hold me down, but to steady me. "Whatever happens next," he said, his forehead almost touching mine. "Remember, this was never your fault." The door handle jerked once. Then the locks began to give. And as the first steel click echoed through the room, he moved in front of me, not as a wall, but as a choice. I felt the first impact before I heard the glass break. A violent crack split the room, then another. Someone shouted outside. Someone else answered with a curse. He didn't turn around. He just stayed in front of me, one hand behind him, palm open, a silent command for his men to hold the line while the door groaned under the weight of what was coming through it. For one impossible second, I saw the old version of him there too. The man who would have met this with fire, with threats, with blood if necessary. But now his shoulders were still. His breathing was measured. He was choosing restraint with every second he remained between me and the men trying to break us apart. "Stay close," he said softly, not as an order, but as a promise. Then the locks gave way. The door slammed inward. 3 men rushed the threshold in black coats, faces hard, weapons raised, all of them aiming for him. He moved once. Fast. Controlled. He disarmed the first before the man could fully lift his arm. My breath caught, But he did not chase the violence. He redirected it, pushed one man into the wall, kicked the second's weapon away. The third froze when he saw me and hesitated just long enough for one of his own people to drag him back. No one touched me. No one got near me. And somehow that was the most terrifying and the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Because this wasn't possession. This was protection with a boundary. This was power finally refusing to become cruelty. The room filled with shouting and scrambling feet. But I could only hear the beat of my own heart as I understood what the storm had really been about. It had never been about whether he could keep me. It had been about whether he could let me choose him without ever taking my choice away. Another crash shook the hallway. A second later, his men secured the entrance, and the last intruder was forced to his knees in the corridor, breathing hard, beaten not by rage but by certainty. He looked back at me then, and in his eyes I saw the cost of what he had done. He had wanted me safe so badly that he had to tear himself open to learn the difference between guarding me and owning me. That was the wound under everything, not the danger outside. The fear inside him that love always ended in loss unless he held on too tightly. I crossed the room before I could talk myself out of it. Every step felt like a decision the old me would have been too afraid to make. I reached him, took his hand, and placed the small key I had kept from part 1 into his palm. The key to the apartment I had once given him as a joke, as a test, as proof that trust could exist without chains. His fingers closed around it slowly. Not because he was taking it, because he was accepting what I meant. You don't have to lock anything anymore, I whispered. His throat moved. He looked at the key, then at me, and something in him finally gave up fighting itself. Not in defeat. In surrender. Real surrender. The kind that costs more than winning ever could. He let out a breath that sounded almost like grief, because he understood now that loving me meant living with the risk of losing me by choice, not preventing that loss by force. And that was the reveal the storm had been building toward all along. I had never been asking him to protect me from the world. I had been asking him to trust me enough to stand beside me in it. He lifted my hand and pressed the key against my palm instead, returning the choice to me, returning the future to us both. The gunfire was gone. The men were silent. Even the room seemed to hold still. Then he leaned his forehead to mine, and for the first time, his silence felt like peace instead of control. If you stay, he said, voice low and raw, it will be because you want me, not because you're afraid of what I can do. I did not answer right away. That was the last part of the payoff. Not a confession, not a promise, a decision. And when I finally closed my fingers around his, I knew the title had never been about a man claiming a woman. It had been about a woman changing the way a man loved until power no longer sounded like possession. Outside, sirens began to rise in the distance. And inside, the future waited for the first time like something neither of us had to survive alone. The first siren was still far off when he let go of my hand, not because he was pulling away, but because he was making room for me to stand on my own. The room had gone quiet in that strange after-sound that always follows a storm, when even the air seems to remember what fear felt like. He did not touch the weapon again. He did not give another order. He just watched me as I stepped forward, my fingers still warm around the key he had pressed into my palm, and I understood that the weight of it was no longer about a door or a safe or a hidden room. It was a choice. Mine. His men stood back in a line of black suits and lowered eyes, waiting for him to decide the shape of the next minute. But he said nothing to them. For once, the city did not bend around his voice. It bent around his silence. I crossed the room and set the key down on the table between us. Not to reject him. To return the part of his life he had always guarded with a closed fist. His jaw tightened, just slightly, like the gesture cost him more than any deal ever had. Then I reached for the ring that had once felt like a claim and held it in my open hand until he looked at it, really looked at it. Not because you chose me, I said, my voice unsteady but clear. Because you finally chose not to choose for me. Something changed in his face then, small and devastating, like a man realizing the thing he feared most had never been my leaving. It had been my staying without freedom. He took the ring from my hand, but only long enough to turn it once between his fingers before placing it gently back in my palm, where it belonged to the future and not to force. Then keep it, he said, and if you wear it, it will mean what you decide it means. Behind us, one of his men shifted, surprised by the softness in his voice. The old version of him would have mistaken surrender for weakness. This one knew better. He turned to the table, opened the folder that had held every threat, every name, every debt, and without ceremony, he slid half of it into the fire in the hearth. Paper curled. Ink vanished. The room smelled like ash and rain. He left the rest on the desk, the responsibilities he could not burn, the consequences he would still carry. That was the price, and he did not look away from it. I watched him write one final instruction on a clean sheet of paper, his hand steady now, his signature smaller than the weight it carried. The clinic on the east side would be protected. The men stationed outside would leave before dawn, and no one would ever come for me there again. Not because I was owned, because I had a life. He folded the paper and handed it to me, not as a command, but as proof. Outside the window, the first light of morning touched the wet pavement, and the black cars waiting below looked less like a warning than a boundary the city would have to respect. I took the paper, then reached up and straightened his collar the way I had once done, only when he was bleeding in places no one could see. He closed his eyes for a second, as if that small gesture hurt and healed him at once. Then he opened them and nodded toward the door, giving me the first and last permission I would ever need. I walked out alone, but not abandoned, and when I looked back, he was still there beside the table, one hand resting on the burned edge of the world he had built, the other empty on purpose, learning how to live with it. In the hallway, one of the younger men stepped aside for me without being told, and I saw it then. The legacy was not the power he had held, but the way he had taught it to kneel.